Cold Spring Pass sits at 9,200 feet of elevation in the Sawtooth Range of central Idaho, on the boundary between Custer and Blaine counties, at the head of a small high country drainage that gathers itself out of 3 hanging cirques and falls eastward into the East Fork of the Bunchgrass River, and from there, by the small, careful arithmetic of continental hydrology, into the Salmon River, into the Snake, into the Columbia, and into the Pacific Ocean. A mile west of the pass, a small stream falls the other way, into Frenchman Creek, which falls into the Big Wood River, which falls into the Magic Reservoir, which is, by every measure of regional irrigation, the small, careful cornerstone of the Wood River Valley's agricultural water supply. The pass is, in the small, precise language of the surveyors who first mapped it in 1878, a continental subdivide, a place where rainwater that lands 200 yards apart from itself ends up 600 miles apart in the world. The pass is bounded on the north by an unnamed peak of 9,718 feet that the local Basque sheepherders called Bizcar, the back, the spine, for the long ridge that drops eastward off it. The pass is bounded on the south by a slightly lower peak, 8,940 feet, which the same sheepherders called Mendinyoa, the small mountain. The 2 peaks frame the pass in a small, careful saddle that from any distance below the tree line appears as a small, clean notch in the otherwise unbroken granite ridgeline that runs north-south for 15 miles in either direction. The pass has been used as a travel corridor by human beings for at least 9,000 years. The northern Shoshone people, by the careful work of regional archaeologists since the 1970s, used the pass as a small, careful, seasonal route between summer hunting grounds in the high country and winter villages in the Big Wood Valley. A route that is, today, marked by a small set of obsidian flakes and worked toolstone that field teams have periodically cataloged in the small flat shelf below the pass on the eastern side. White prospectors used the pass between 1879 and approximately 1908, when a small set of placer gold operations in the East Fork drainage made the pass a small, careful mule train route to the supply town of Haley. Basque sheepherders used the pass between 1908 and 1962, in the long, careful summer migrations that brought sheep up out of the Wood River Valley to the high alpine pastures of the Sawtooths and back down again before the autumn snows. The pass has been used by every modern measure, only by a small, careful trickle of summer hikers, since approximately 1975, when the Sawtooth National Recreation Area was established and the modern trail network was completed. The pass appears on USGS topographic maps as a small, unmarked saddle. The pass appears on no major modern hiking guidebook as a destination of interest. The pass is, in the small, careful estimate of every Sawtooth backcountry ranger I have ever spoken to, crossed by perhaps 15 or 20 hikers in any given summer. I had, on the morning of the 13th of October 2025, been the only person on the pass for 2 weeks. I had been, by every measure of modern American backcountry recreation, completely off the radar. Half a mile north of the pass, in a small hanging valley behind a granite shoulder that hides the valley entirely from any view from the pass itself, sits a small log cabin that my great-grandfather Joseba Etzeberria built in the summer of 1916, when he was 28 years old and was the lead herder for a small Basque American sheep operation that had been running flocks through Cold Spring Pass since 1908. I have, in the 200 days since the morning of the 13th of October, lived in that cabin alone. My name is Lena Etzeberria. I am 47 years old. I had been, until October, a vegetation ecologist, working as a senior consultant for a small environmental consulting firm in Boise, Idaho, doing the small, careful field surveys and impact assessments that the kind of land use decisions of the modern American West require. This is how the small, carefully restored Basque sheepherder's cabin of my great-grandfather, in a hanging valley off a forgotten mountain pass in the Sawtooth Range, became, in the world that has come, the place I'm almost certainly going to spend the rest of my life in. I want to tell you about my family, because the family is the small, careful inheritance that has made every other detail of this account possible. The first Echevarria came to Idaho in 1908. He was Joseba Echevarria, my great-grandfather, who had emigrated from the small village of Lacatio in the Basque country of northern Spain at the age of 20, in the small, careful migration of Basque sheep herders that had been bringing young men to the American West since the 1880s. He had been hired by a sheep operation owner in the Wood River Valley named Donovan McKinney, who had a substantial Basque workforce and who needed a young man to take over a small herding contract that ran sheep through the Sawtooth High Country every summer. Joseba had taken the contract. He had been running sheep through Cold Spring Pass every summer between 1908 and 1942, when his small, careful retirement at the age of 54 had been precipitated by the death of Donovan McKinney and the slow, careful winding down of the operation. Joseba had built the cabin in 1916 because he had decided, in the small, private way of a Basque sheepherder who had spent 8 summers sleeping in canvas tents at 9,000 feet of elevation, that he wanted a permanent base. He had cut the logs himself, by hand, from the small stand of Engelmann spruce that grew at the south end of the hanging valley. He had assembled the cabin over 3 summer seasons. He had finished the roof in 1918. He had used the cabin every summer for the next 24 years. He had passed the small, careful operation down to his son, Michael Echevarria, my grandfather, who had taken over the contract in 1942 at the age of 19, and who had run sheep through the same pass for the next 20 years. Michael had been the last Echevarria to use the cabin as an active herding base. The grazing leases had been gradually withdrawn through the 1950s as the federal government had reorganized public lands management. The last Echevarria sheep had crossed Cold Spring Pass in the autumn of 1962. Michael had been 39. Michael had retained ownership of the cabin and the small 5-acre patented mining claim that the family had picked up in 1928 from a defunct placer operation. He had visited the cabin in the summers, with my father and uncles, throughout my own childhood. He had taught my father and my uncles to read the small, careful weather of the high country, to identify the plants of the alpine zone, to track the movement of game, and to live in the cabin in the small, careful, self-sufficient way that Joseba had taught him. Michael had died in 2015 at the age of 92. He had left the cabin to me. He had left it to me by the small, careful judgment of his late life, because I had been the one of his 8 grandchildren who had been making the long, careful trip to the cabin with him every summer of my adult life, and because I had been, by his own quiet observation over 30 years, the one who had been listening when he talked about the place. I had inherited the cabin in the autumn of 2015. I had been 36 years old. I had spent the next 10 years on weekends and vacations restoring it. I want to compress, because the small, careful work of 10 years of cabin restoration is not the central thing this account is for. But I want to put on the page that the work was the small, organizing principle of my life from 2015 to 2025. I replaced the roof in 2016. The original 1918 cedar shakes had been quietly degrading for 50 years. With a new run of cedar shakes that I cut and shaped myself in the small, careful method that my grandfather had taught me. I replaced the rotten lower courses of logs in 2017 and 2018 by the slow, patient method of jacking the cabin up off its sill and replacing the logs one at a time. I rebuilt the stone fireplace in 2019. I dug a new root cellar in 2020. The original 1916 root cellar had collapsed in the 1970s by hand, with a single mattock and a single shovel over 4 long summer weekends. I rebuilt the small woodshed in 2021. I rebuilt the privy in 2022. I deepened and recased the small spring-fed well that Joseba had dug in 1916. And that had, by every measure I could give it over 100 years of intermittent use, been holding clean, cold water continuously the whole time. In 2023. I installed a small, efficient, wood-burning cook stove in 2024. The cabin, by the morning of the 13th of October, 2025, was the small, careful 18 by 24-foot log structure my great-grandfather had built in 1916, plus a small loft I had added in 2018, plus the small, careful 109 years of accumulated craft and care that 4 generations of Etziberius had put into it. The cabin was, by every measure I could give it, the most loved place in my life. The cabin was, also by every measure of public access, almost completely unknown. The patented mining claim is private property, but the property does not appear on any current map of the Sawtooth National Recreation Area as a private inholding. The cabin is not on any federal or state register. The cabin does not show up in any of the small, careful guidebooks of historic backcountry structures that the Forest Service and the Idaho Historical Society have published over the years. The cabin is, by the small, careful inattention of every modern bureaucracy, a structure that does not exist on any version of an official map. I had been the only person, on the morning of the 13th of October, 2025, who knew exactly where it was. The morning of the 13th of October, 2025, was a Monday. I had been at the cabin for 14 days. I had taken 2 weeks of vacation from my job, the kind of careful working from the cabin trip I had been making once or twice a year since 2018, in the small, careful arrangement my employer had been willing to honor as part of my professional autonomy, to do a final set of cabin maintenance projects before the winter, and to spend a small, private set of days in the high country at the small, precious window of late autumn, when the larches turn gold and the first snow has not yet come down. The first sign that anything was wrong was the small, portable shortwave radio I kept on the cabin's mantel. A small Sangeon ATS-505 that had belonged to my father and that I had inherited at his death in 2019. The radio had been, for 14 days, my only outside world contact. The radio had been broadcasting in the small, careful pattern I had been listening to for 14 years of cabin trips, the familiar AM and FM stations from the Wood River Valley and from Boise, plus the small set of NOAA weather broadcasts. The radio, on the morning of the 13th, was carrying nothing but the Federal Emergency Alert System tone on every commercial frequency I could find. I had been listening for 90 minutes when the tone broke at 6:54 a.m. into a single national network broadcast that was relaying, in the small, steady, careful voice of an announcer who had been awake for too long, the kind of advisory that I had not, in any version of my 47 years, ever heard before. I had a small satellite phone unit at the cabin that I kept for emergencies. I had bought it in 2020 at my brother Anton's careful insistence. I called Anton. Anton picked up on the second ring. He had been, by his own quick first words, awake. He said, "Lena, where are you? Are you at the cabin?" I said, "I'm at the cabin." He said, "Stay there." I said, "Anton, what is happening?" He said, "Lena, listen to me. I am going to tell you what I think is happening. I think we are at the start of something we have not seen before. I think it is going to get worse before it gets better. I think the mountains are going to be safer than the cities for a long time. Lena, please, stay at the cabin. Do not try to drive out. Do not try to come down to Boise. We will figure out how to find each other whenever this is going to be findable." I said, "Anton, I love you. Tell Marisol and the kids." He said, "I love you too, Len. Stay safe." The call ended at 6:58 a.m. on the morning of the 13th of October, 2025. The satellite phone died by some failure of the satellite network I have not, in 200 days, been able to fully understand. About 3 days later, I have been at the cabin since. I want to compress, because the daily texture of 200 days alone in a small Basque sheepherder's cabin in the Sawtooth High Country is its own slow, careful story. I had food at the cabin for approximately 5 weeks at full ration, plus the substantial supply of dried and preserved foods I had been quietly stockpiling at the cabin over years, for reasons of my own personal sense of preparedness in remote area work. I supplemented in November with a careful set of game. I shot a single mule deer at the south end of the Hanging Valley on the morning of the 2nd of November by the small, careful skill my grandfather had taught me, and I processed the animal in the small, careful way he had also taught me. The deer fed me as carefully preserved jerky and as smoked meat for approximately 60 days. I supplemented further with the small, careful foraging that the hanging valley supports. I knew, by the small, careful, professional knowledge of a vegetation ecologist who had spent 20 years working in the western mountains, every edible plant in the alpine zone above the cabin and in the subalpine zone below it. I had been mapping the plants for years. I knew where the wild onions came up in early summer. I knew where the small, careful patches of mountain sorrel grew. I knew where the elderberries fruited in the late summer. I drew water from the spring-fed well Joseba dug in 1916. I heated the cabin with the wood stove I had installed in 2024, fueled by the substantial supply of split firewood I had been quietly accumulating in the small woodshed for 10 years, and that I had been topping off on every cabin trip in the small, careful pattern of a vegetation ecologist who had been quietly preparing for a longer stay than she had ever quite admitted to herself she might be making. I read. I had brought on this trip 12 books. On this trip, I had at the cabin, from years of accumulation, perhaps 80 more. I read most of them, some of them several times. I worked. I have, in 200 days, completed every small, careful improvement on the cabin that I had been planning to do over the next 5 years. I have replaced the small set of failing window glazings. I have rebuilt the small set of interior shelves. I have built a small writing desk against the east wall, looking out at the cirque. I have, in the last 6 weeks, started a small alpine garden in a sheltered spot below the cabin, planting a careful set of cool weather crops I had brought up in seed packets in October. Kale, mash, peas, radishes that have, by the small, careful good fortune of a wet spring at high elevation, started to come up. I have, in 200 days, written by hand the first 300 pages of a small natural history of the Cold Spring Pass drainage that I had been planning to write for 10 years and that I had not, in the small busy years of consulting work, ever started. I made my first radio contact on the morning of the 21st of November. I had been working since the first week of November on a small, careful project of getting the Sangyan's shortwave bands working at this elevation. The cabin's hanging valley, by the small, careful electromagnetic geography of mountains, is a difficult place to receive HF signals from. I had rigged a wire antenna up the small dead spruce at the north end of the cabin's clearing. The radio picked up, on the morning of the 21st, a small daily check-in being run by a man named Garrett Tippett, who was 64 years old, who had been a backcountry pack station manager out of Stanley, Idaho, before his retirement in 2022, and who had been holding together, since the third week of October, a small, careful network of about 18 operators across the central Idaho mountains. I have been speaking on a careful daily schedule with Garrett every morning at 7 a.m. since the 22nd of November. Through Garrett's network, I have been able to maintain a small, careful weekly relay with my brother Anton in Boise. Anton and his wife Marisol and their 2 children, my niece Sophia, 11, and my nephew Inico, 8, are alive at a small, fortified neighborhood block in the north end of Boise. They are well. They are eating. They are not, by Anton's careful weekly assessment, going to attempt any kind of long, careful trip across the Wood River Valley to the Sawtooths in any near-term future. The cities, by Anton's professional engineering judgment, are slowly stabilizing. The Boise community is rebuilding. Anton has asked me, in several careful conversations over the last 3 months, what my plans are. I have told him, in the most recent of these conversations on the morning of the 17th of April, that I am staying. I want to put on the page why I am staying, because the staying is the central decision of this account, and I want to be careful about it. I am staying because the cabin is the place that I have, in the small, careful way of my own slow life, been quietly preparing to live in for 10 years. The restoration work that I had been doing on weekends and vacations from 2015 to 2025 had been, by my own slow, private understanding of the work, the small organizing project of my middle adulthood. I had been, in some way I had not fully articulated to myself, building a place to spend my old age in. I had been planning to retire to the cabin in approximately 20 years. I had been planning, in the small, careful way of a single woman who had decided that her life's work would not include marriage or children, to make the cabin the small, careful structure of my late life solitude. The world has, by the small, terrible, unexpected acceleration of October, brought that retirement forward by 20 years. I am living in the future I had been quietly planning for. The future is, by every measure of my own internal experience over 200 days, exactly what I had been planning it to be. I want to put that on the page because I think it is one of the things that the world that has come will not, in its first careful generation of survival narratives, want to acknowledge. That some of the people who have ended up alone in remote places had been, in the small private versions of their own lives, choosing exactly that kind of solitude long before the catastrophe arrived. I had been one of those people. I am one of those people. I am going to be one of those people for the rest of my life. I am going to keep the cabin, keep the garden, keep the small daily radio contact with Garrett and the careful weekly relay with Anton, keep the writing, keep the work of being the careful long tenant of a place that 4 generations of my family loved before me. The work is, in the world that has come, exactly what I want to be doing. That is, by my own quiet decision in the conversations of the last 6 weeks, what I am committing to. If you are reading this, if you have, by some long, unspecified chain of events, walked the small, unmaintained trail that climbs out of the East Fork of the Bunchgrass River drainage and that comes up over Cold Spring Pass at 9,200 feet of elevation, and have walked north from the pass for half a mile along the small contour line that traverses the granite shoulder of the unnamed peak. The Basque herders called Bizkar, and have come to the small hidden hanging valley behind the shoulder, and have found a small 18 by 24 foot log cabin in a small clearing of subalpine fir at the south end of the valley. I want you to know 2 things. The first is that I am almost certainly here. If I am, I will hear you coming. The valley is small enough and quiet enough that any human approach is audible from inside the cabin, from approximately 200 yards out. I will come out to meet you. I will not be armed if I have time to assess that you are not a threat, and I will be armed if I do not. Walk slowly, call out, identify yourself. If I am not here when you arrive, if, by some unforeseen event, my long, careful staying has ended, the cabin is yours. The small concealed key is in a hollow at the base of the 3rd stone of the fireplace, from the floor, on the inside of the cabin, in a small steel canister wrapped in oiled cloth. The well works. The wood stove draws cleanly. The root cellar is stocked. The small alpine garden, in season, will produce more food than one careful person needs. The library is on the shelves. The radio frequency for Garrett Tippett's network is written on a small index card I keep tucked into the front cover of The Land of Little Rain on the 3rd shelf. If you join the network and tell Garrett that Lena Exaberia sent you, he will know what to do. The second is that the small, forgotten, high country structures of the American West, the prospector cabins, the line shacks, the herder camps, the abandoned ranger stations, the fire lookout caches, the mining claim cabins on patented inholdings inside otherwise federal land, are, in the world that has come, the small, careful inheritance that the late 19th and early 20th centuries left for people who would, in some unforeseen century, need to disappear into a landscape. There are, by the careful estimates of Forest Service historic structure inventories, perhaps 15,000 of these structures still standing across the public lands of the western United States. Most of them are unmapped. Most of them are unmaintained. Most of them are, by every measure of modern public knowledge, unknown. If you are a survivor in the American West and you are looking for a place to disappear into, find one of them. The small county courthouse will, in many western counties, have records of patented mining claims that are still in private ownership, sitting deep inside surrounding federal land, with small, careful structures still standing on them. The Forest Service heritage inventories will, if you can access them through the small surviving libraries of the western communities, list the herder camps and the line shacks. The small, careful old-timers of the surviving small mountain towns will, if you can find one and ask carefully, know the names of the cabins. The cabins are the small, careful gift that the people who built them left for whoever, 110 years later, was going to need to live where they had lived. The morning is bright. The first cinquefoil and pasque flower in the small alpine meadow above the cabin are coming into bloom. The snow on the north face of Biscar, which has been holding through the long, high country winter, is breaking up in the careful, slow sun of late spring. The small spring at the wellhead, which has been quietly flowing for 110 years, is running at the small, careful flow that it always runs at in the first weeks of May. A pair of Clark's nutcrackers, birds I've been quietly observing and writing notes on for 10 years, are working the small stand of white bark pine at the south end of the valley. I'm going to put down the small leather-bound notebook I have been writing this in. I'm going to walk out to the small alpine garden to harvest the morning's mâche and the first radishes of the year. I am going to walk back to the cabin, too. I am going to make the small, careful breakfast of my own 10-year practice. Black coffee from the small, careful supply of beans I am, today, beginning to ration carefully because the supply will not last another 12 months, and a small portion of last year's smoked deer meat with the morning's greens. I am going to spend the day doing the small, careful work I have been doing for 200 days. I am going to read. I am going to write. I am going to walk the small, careful daily perimeter of the hanging valley. I am going to listen for Garrett's afternoon check-in at 3 p.m. I am going to do today the work that I had been planning to spend the second half of my life doing. That is, by every measure that matters, enough. Lena Exberia Cold Spring Pass, Cabin, Sawtooth Range, Custer County, Idaho. 1 May 20 to 26.